Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take another look at our CentOS install, and specifically, we are going to focus on how to interact with our firewall and our firewall service. Now, this is not meant to be a comprehensive video. This is just going to show you an overview of how we can check to see the status of our firewall and also the firewall daemon and do some basic modifications to the firewall as well as the service. In future videos and for future projects, then we will likely have to make some additional changes or some additional videos. And so to begin with, the first thing that we want to sort of understand is the way that Linux and for that matter, other operating systems work is that generally speaking, you'll have a set of command line tools that will allow for you to check to see if certain features are running. In this case, what we're going to see is that there are one set of tools or commands that will allow for you to check to see if the firewall itself is up, as well as modifying the firewall. And then there's going to be a second set of tools that allow for you to modify or configure the services. The services in general are things that you would expect to start automatically when your operating system starts. In other words, it's things that you don't necessarily have to manually do. And the same is true on Windows, on a Mac, that there are certain things that simply start when you boot your operating system. The same in Linux. So the first thing that we want to do is we simply want to look at the firewall itself. In other words, we want to understand what is the status of our firewall and perhaps look at some of the features and some of the things that we could do in the future. And the easiest way to do this is just to simply go ahead and run the sudo command on our firewall command. And what we're going to do then is you'll see that there's actually a couple of things here that we can leverage. Specifically, we're going to leverage our firewall-cmd. And what we want to do is we want to see what options are available. And the easiest way to do that is to hit two dashes and then hit tab. You're going to be prompted with many Linux applications or executables if you have multiple options here to display all of them. In this case, we do in fact want to see all 101 possibilities. And in this case, you'll see that there's a lot of options. We can add, for instance, ports, we can exception ports, we can query the policy, get the policy, we can remove services, remove ports, etc. But the one that we're interested in is going to be to take a look. We might as well go ahead and look at the version as well as the state. Again, we can see the version of our firewall, and we can also see the state of our firewall. In this case, it's running. It's running because by default, with a from scratch installation of CentOS, it's simply going to put up the firewall. Now, there's a few base exceptions that we could take a look at. Particularly, you'll discover that, for instance, that CentOS by default is going to accept a ping request. If you try to ping a virtual machine with the firewall on, it should by default simply respond. You can harden that, or you can also change that behavior as well. And then the second thing that we want to look at is we want to look at the services. And so again, what we will do is we'll simply use sudo. In some cases, you don't need to use sudo, but in case we're going to be making some changes, we will. And so what we want to do then is we want to look at the state of the firewall service or the status of the firewall service. Now, keep in mind, the status of the firewall service is different than the firewall itself. And so effectively what you can do is you can have the firewall in a manual start state so that the service itself doesn't run automatically. However, the firewall can be then turned on. Now, that we're not going to investigate that, but what we are going to see is how we would go about checking using the system CTL, the status of what is our firewall daemon. And so one of the things that's pretty common, you're going to discover this in a few other examples, is that oftentimes whatever the name of the application is, or the feature, in this case, the firewall, you simply add a D for daemon, which indicates that's the service name for that particular application. In other words, that's what essentially launches the firewall automatically when the operating system boots. And again, you can see here from the firewall daemon, the service itself is active. The firewall is, in fact, responding. You can see a little bit of information about what process ID it's using and some of the resources it's using. Now, one of the things that you can do is you can simply just change or stop the firewall. And so, example, what we would like to do is we would like to simply stop our firewall daemon. And we can simply change our status then to stop. Again, there's no positive confirmation that anything was done. And so what you want to do then is simply rerun the status. And you'll see that now the firewall is listed as inactive or dead. Now, the other thing we can do to verify this is we can simply go back to the original firewall command when we were looking at the state, and you'll see that it is, in fact, not running. Now, this is essentially an easy way for us to stop our firewall for testing purposes. In other words, if we're done testing, in other words, we've figured out that the service is, in fact, running. Perhaps you have a web server that's running, but the firewall is blocking the ability for your clients to get to that web service. You can temporarily drop your firewall and then check to see if, in this case, the web service is running. Well, you probably don't want to do that permanently. And so as such, the next time you reboot your CentOS virtual machine, the firewall will simply come back up when the operating system starts. You can also do this manually by simply changing the stop firewall daemon to start. And again, you will be able to start your firewall. And again, we can verify this a couple of different ways. We can either use the firewall command to check the state, which you'll see is now running again, or what you can do is you can also use the systemctl and check to see what the status is of your firewall daemon. So in this case, I'm just going to replace my start with status, and you'll see that once again, we are active and we are running. Now, for the last thing that we want to focus on in this video is how would you permanently disable or re-enable your firewall? Well, again, what you would do is you would simply leverage your systemctl command. That's essentially what that is that's the one that allows for you to control your services. And we would again have to use sudo. So it's going to be sudo systemctl. What we want to do is we want to enable or disable the firewall. We're going to start off by disabling our firewall. And again, you want to use the name of that daemon. So it's going to be firewall D. And I misspelled this. I said it correctly. There's the systemctl disable firewall D. And you can see that it is removing that as an active service. So now what happens is if you come along and you search for the status of the firewall daemon, or you look for the status of the firewall daemon, you'll see that it is still listed as active. However, though, it is no longer set to start actively. So again, here, if we come up here, we've removed this, and so it's still running. However, though, it is not going to be running the next time we boot the machine. And so we can turn this around, or we can undo this change by simply typing in enable firewall daemon, and that will then re-enable that as a service on startup. Now, you can confirm this. This would take a little long for our video, so I'm not going to do this, but you could technically go ahead and disable the firewall, reboot your machine, and then check the status, and you'll see that you, in fact, do not have your firewall running. This is a permanent way to disable your firewall, and unless you know that your machine is going to be in a protected environment. For this particular example, since we're on a private network, it should be fine. But if you are on a public network, or if you plan to make this machine publicly exposed or public available on the internet, then you definitely do not want to disable your firewall. If anything, what you want to do is you want to go back now to the firewall command. And what we can do is we can look then again at all 101 possibilities, and we'll cover some of these in our later videos. But the idea is that this is how you would go about adding, for instance, a service, or in the example of the HTTP or web server, you can also add a specific port, and you can enable then that port by simply starting and stopping your, or rather stopping and starting your firewall. So hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.